Hey guys, so in this lecture what we're going to see is component lifecycle. I know we've already been implementing component. We've seen a couple of methods like component will mount and things like that. But in this lecture we'll try to cover more of these methods, and I'll try to explain you with an example on how these come into effect, what gets triggered when, and when should you use which method. So there are multiple methods. I'll just throw the names at you right now because I want them to be registered in your mind, and as we go with the example I'll explain you what these components are. Okay, so the first one is component will mount, the next one is component did mount, the next one is component will receive props, the next one is should component update, the next one is component will update, the component did update, and component will unmount. So these are like the 8 methods that we're going to talk about in this lecture. I'm going to show you with an example on when each of them gets called. Okay, so let's get started. So from the code perspective, you can see the screen, components lifecycle. This is just the basic skeleton that we've been using in the previous lectures too. Again, you have the start and the end folder. You can start from the start and you can find the completed code in the end folder. So we're going to continue the same pattern, and if you're continuing your exercise from the previous lecture, just clean up the code and you can use the same files. You don't have to download it again. I have the app, I have the header, I have the content. Let's create another component inside the content, which is a child component to content, and see what we can achieve out of it. Let's create a component called number component, where we will just have a small button and that updates the number. And then let's see how the lifecycle methods get called and get updated accordingly. So let's create a copy this. Let's create number component, and instead of returning all this, let's just do a div. So we have the empty divs returning so far, and then let's just return a button, and this button will just do is update number. So let's call it as update number. So we have the button and that does the update of number. Now in the content class, let's create the constructor because we need to set some data out here. Let's say we have a data as 0, which is the number that we're going to use and we're going to update. Let's also create another function which is called as set new number, which will be just doing an update to the original number. So the way we do it is set new number. Now we have this method. Let's go inside this method and just do the this dot set state, and the way we do it is we pass in the parameters. So now we have the name value pair. So the thing that we are going to update is the data, and we are going to update it with this dot state dot data plus 1. So whatever it is the value, it gets updated. And don't forget to bind the method. So this dot set number, set new number is equal to this dot set new number dot bind, and then this. So that way you're binding the function. So you have created these two lifecycle functions. Let's just move this button to the content or the component out here, and now that we have moved it there, let's just also write this component over here saying number component. And for now let's just call this component and see what happens. We're not passing in anything. Just click save and the page should refresh, and you can just see update number. Now when you do the update number, let's just also try to pass the data to this number component, and the way we pass the data is using the properties. So let's say my number is equals to this dot state dot data. So that's how you can pass in the number. Now you have the number as a property. We can just display this dot props dot my number, and the data should be displayed to you. So if you start with a 0, it should start displaying 0 out here. Let's put it in an h4 tag so that it has some space and it is a little bolder. So that way, yes, it's separated. Now that we have all this content on for us, let's also make sure we call the on click. So we have on click, and in the on click we'll just call it this.set new number, and it should call the method which will increment the number and update the state. Let's try to see it in action by clicking the number, and everything works well. Now let's see how the component lifecycle methods fit into this whole scenario. So let's go ahead and write them in the number component. So the first one that we're going to see is component will mount. Now what this method will do is component will mount is executed before rendering on both the server as well as the client. So whenever you call component will mount, it will render before, or it will call just before rendering the component. So let's do a console.log and say call the component will mount. Okay, so we know that component will mount will be called. The next, let me just copy this and I'll just update the contents. So the next one that we have is component did mount. So instead of will, this has to be a did. Now component did mount is executed after the first render, only on the client side. So this is a difference. So component will mount will be server as well as the client. Component did mount is only on the client side. This is where you will put in all your AJAX requests and probably DOM or state updates that should occur. This method is used for integration with JavaScript frameworks and any functions with delayed execution like set timeout, set interval. We can also use them in this particular function. Let's see the next one, which is component will receive props. So let me just paste it again, and instead of will mount, let's just replace it will receive props. No space. Let's update this. Will receive props. Okay. Now this component will receive props is invoked as soon as the props are updated before another render is called. So whenever there is an update in your properties, which means the parent changes the content or content that is passed to the child, the component will receive props is invoked. Now we triggered it when the set new number, when we update the state. So whenever in the number component, it will be called when we update the set new number in the parent. Okay. Now component will receive props also receive the new set of props. So we need to make sure that we pass in the new props, otherwise it will cause an error. So let's say new props. The next one that we are going to see is should component update. Now should component update should return true or false. This will determine if the component will be updated or not updated. This is set to true by default, and if you're sure that the component doesn't need to render after the state or the props are updated, you can manually pass in a false and return false. Should component update, and again this receives or this takes in two particular input parameters, new props and next state. Now let's just go and copy the console. Let's say components should component update. Now let's also make sure that we return a true so that the components get updated, which is the default value. The next one that we are going to see is component will update, and which is just called before rendering. So let's just write it, component will update. So there was one mount and this is update. So will mount, which means about to be mount or invoked, rendering is about to be invoked, and will update, which means it's about to be rendered. Let's just copy the console, will update. Okay. And again, just like should component update, it also expects a new props and next state. Let's make sure we pass in those parameters. Just like component will update, we also have something called as component did update, and which is very obvious just by the name of it. This gets invoked whenever, or this gets called just before rendering, and component did update would be just after rendering, so that you have control before and after your rendering happens. let's say did update. This should save. And the last one is very easy. It's called component will unmount. Just like component will mount, you get to know when the rendering happens. Similarly, you need to also know when the component unmounts. So let's just do a component. Instead of will mount, I will make it unmount and make sure M is lowercase. And again, this doesn't accept any parameters, so you just have to give components will unmount. And let's do a console log. Let me copy this rather, it's easier that way. Component will mount. Let's just copy this to will unmount. Now, we cannot straight away see component unmount unless we close the application or manually unmount the component, which we will cover a little later, but let's just see these components in a detail. So let me just open the logs so that we can see everything that we need to. And let me just make sure I update this to a div, because p tag should never contain the contents of h1 in it. So I just updated that, so at least those errors are gone. This error is expected because of a plugin that I'm using. So the first thing that you see is component will mount and did mount, and they happen in a sequence. So the first thing happens is whenever this component gets mounted, you say will mount and then did mount. Now when we click the button, what will happen is it will say component will receive props, because now the number has got updated. And of course, once the number is updated, it will also update the component, which means component will update, and then component did update. So let's try to click the button and see what happens. So you see component will receive props, component should component update. This got called and the answer was true, and that's the reason you got component updated. And just before updating, it called component will update, and just after updating, it called component did update. Make sense? Right. So now the next and the final thing is component will unmount. So how can we check that? Well, it's very easy. We just have to unmount our component from the application. Let's try to unmount this number form. Actually, let's just try to unmount the overall component by setting an interval. Okay, the way we can unmount is we can put a set timeout onto the original or index.js and try to unmount the app itself and see what happens. It should get updated in the console log. So the way we do it is we put in the set timeout. So set timeout, it is a function. So you have the first parameter as a function, and let's have the function, comma, the time. So let's say it happens in 10 seconds. Now let's just write the function call on what needs to happen. So just the way we use React DOM to render something onto the screen, we can use the same React DOM and update the screen, which is unmount. So let's do a React DOM dot unmount component at node, and here we can pass in the node element, which is document dot get element by ID, and the way we can have the ID is the root. Now we got this, let's close the component mount and everything should work. And within 10 seconds we should see the screen getting updated, and the console.log should display the component will unmount. You can see this, and the screen got blank. So now the component will unmount method was called whenever the component is taken off the screen. So sometimes you have a flickering visibility, or something just pops up only for 10 seconds and goes away, or something comes up only after 5 seconds and then goes away after 10 seconds. So you can play with it as much as you want with your app. Okay, so these were the lifecycle methods that we wanted to see. I just wanted to rewind and make sure that you understand. The first one was component will mount just before rendering, component did mount after rendering, component will receive props, which is just about to receive the props from the parent. Should update will return a true or a false if the component needs to update or it doesn't need to. And if component needs to update, it will update. So component will update will call. And just after updating the component did update will call. And of course, when the component unmounts, the component unmount will call. So make sure you understand these lifecycle methods, play around with it, and let me know if you have any questions in the Q&A section. I'll see you in the next class.